Well, good day to everyone joining us and welcome to today's X-Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled How Leveraging an Asia-Pacific Network Can Create Regional Efficiencies in Clinical Supply Management. My name is Andrew Jordan and I'll be your X-Talks host for today. Now, today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes, and this presentation includes a Q&A session with our speaker. This webinar is designed to be interactive, and webinars work best when you're involved. So please feel free to submit your questions and your comments for our speaker throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. Now, this chat box is located in the control panel that's on the right-hand side of your screen. And if you require any assistance, please contact me at any time by sending a message using that chat panel. And at this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. And please note that this event will be recorded and made available for future download. Now, a big thanks to Catalent, who helped develop the content for this webinar. A global leader in clinical supply, Catalent partners with sponsors to accelerate and scale their trials with innovative, flexible, and reliable supply solutions. Catalent provides comprehensive and integrated services for sponsors and studies of all sizes. They offer full-service packaging, cold chain distribution, and specialized capabilities across the globe to solve clinical supply challenges. All right, well, now I'd like to introduce you to your speaker for today's webinar. Daniel Gao is Site Director of Catalent Pharma Solutions Clinical Supply Facility in Shanghai, China. In this role, he oversees clinical supply operations in China with an emphasis on service delivery, quality, and operational excellence. Previous roles at Catalent include Account Director of Greater China, where he focused on supporting customers and business development within China. Now, prior to joining Catalent, Daniel was the head of Clinical Trials China for Cardinal Health. He holds an MBA from Ryerson University in Canada with a specialization in supply chain management and an MSc in project management from Manchester University in the UK. And now, it's with my pleasure to hand the microphone and the presentation over to Daniel right now. Daniel.
Thank you, Andrew. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of our global participants. Thanks for joining today's webinar. I'm Daniel Gao. In this webinar, we will discuss how to leverage the major clinical supply centers of China, Singapore, and Japan to support clinical trials within the Asia-Pacific region. We will look at some recent trends in the region and discuss some of the challenges that companies face when conducting trials there. We will review some of the important considerations that should be taken into account when developing a traditional clinical supply model. We will look at the importance of a strong and experienced global clinical supplies partner with on-the-ground local expertise. We will also summarize how to best leverage each of major Asia-Pacific clinical supply center that we will look to the future in the supply strategy that meets the needs not only of today, but for tomorrow. So Catalent has more than 15 years of experience in Asia-Pacific region. Following a strong history of distribution into the region, Catalent was one of the first global clinical supply providers to provide distribution out of Singapore area. In 2013, we launched our full service and world-class facility near Shanghai. And we are the first global provider to offer primary packaging capabilities in the region. In 2016, we opened a site in Japan to serve that country exclusively. We partner with a wide range of sponsors globally, many of which are extending prior reach into the Asia-Pacific region. So globally, we offer substantial experience in clinical trials. We have a comprehensive and wide range of service offerings and market-leading project management. We have excellent performance, actually, and we have a network of sites, both Catalent-owned and third-party partners and depots, carriers, and cold chain management to do the job in Asia Pacific. Our locations and capabilities service the world. Our location capability and capacities are increasing rapidly in response to ever-changing clinical needs in the markets around the world. We offer market-leading timelines, project management, and are well-positioned to package, label, and distribute clinical trial supplies and provide service in all regions of the world. We provide this service extensively and service more than 1,000 customers and accounts globally. We are some of the recent trends supporting the continued Asia-Pacific appeal and what needs to be addressed for success. There are several aspects to address. I'd like to cover some of those trends now. So what are some of the recent trends supporting the continued Asia-Pacific appeal and what needs to be addressed for success? There are several aspects to address. I'd like to cover some of those trends now. So this chart shows some data from clinicaltrials.gov database, which shows information about new studies that are first received and registered. There is a great indication of the level of activity and the need for clinical supplies in the regions. On the left-hand side of the chart, you will see a heat map that shows the intensity of the global supplies in 2016. You would expect to see United States as the leading high concentration of the trials, followed by Europe, and then followed by various countries to the east. So most notably in this chart, you will see China. But it's interesting to kind of click on that area and because Asia Pacific region is actually quite large when you assemble the variety of the countries that are shown in the map. So on the right-hand side shows some of the yearly trends associated with the region. So you can see that the trial activities is a little bit flat, although we know the global market clinical trial are dropping. So we see a steady clinical supply activities in Asia Pacific region. That 38% of the global trials of the countries or global trials will have clinical sites in this region. It's not as obvious as I mentioned earlier, the size of this region, but if you add up the Asia Pacific region, you see there in the top left of the chart, there is 1,601 studies that were received by the data source. That's actually more than what we have seen in Western Europe combined. It's really a large market, and it is going to remain attractive. So as we can see, Australia leads the way, followed by South Korea, Japan, and China, as you can see from the chart. Geographic size, like in the case of China, is not necessarily the leading indicator of study potential. So some of the smaller nations, like Taiwan, have a very high level of interest in clinical trials, in Taiwan. There is a large population density in urban concentration. That is a really good spot to do clinical trial in general. The environmental factors and the disease tendency potential, I will call it, in several therapeutic area is high and attractive to sponsors to bring their drugs into the trial. An example of that would be the liver cancer. There's some statistic from globalcancermap.com, part of World Health Organization that talks about almost 85% of liver cancer cases occur in these nations. China, for example, has an incidence of 25 out of 100,000 people, where in contrast, the US has a rate of just 4 cases. It supports the notion that this population, this region, and it has a high need and therefore is a great place to clinical trials. There are huge infrastructure and tribal diversity there, as we know. All this kind of put together, we expect these factors as well as many other to continue the region's appeal to sponsors. This appeal, we believe, will outweigh the challenge as we get better partners for the sponsors in the region to help them conduct the clinical trials. So Asia Pacific is a very broad region, as you all know. It's a widespread and diverse. It spans over 24 countries, a population of 2 billion people and growing. Just a statistic to put in perspective, 1 out of every 3 on our Earth live in this region. So again, it reinforced the appeal of the region to do clinical trials. And therefore, we need to be good in providing clinical trial supplies into the region. There are definitely many culture and language barriers that make things difficult. As I said earlier, some of those are starting to mitigate, but there's a lot of variety to deal with when you work in the region. One of the points of the presentation today is really to have a global clinical supplies partner with a local presence to help you get those some of those challenges. The very complex logistic and the infrastructure concerns in the area, availability of the local supplies from a global sponsor standpoint, and the product's availabilities is challenging. It's very difficult for clinical sponsors to find a reliable source, and especially the capabilities in the region that they are used to deal with in other more developed parts of the world in the clinical supply industry. Regulatory and customs challenges galore in this region for sure. The industry is not standardized like we would see in other parts of the world. For instance, in Europe, where we have clinical trial regulations and standardized, for instance, with the EMEA member states, there's not an organization like that controlling this diverse grouping of nations in Asia. Even though the appeal is very large, there's a lot of uniqueness countries to country that has not been dealt with as you go there. We also see strict international quality requirements as highly difficult to find that has to be put in place in many cases in order to meet the standards that the sponsor are used to as well. Broad individual country requirements, as I mentioned, when we are doing global studies involving a number of countries in the region, This adds another degree of complexity. Sponsors really need to address this challenge, and that's where a good, strong, and well-located global clinical supply partner fits into the equation. So choosing the right global clinical supply partner for a supply chain can make difference between success and failure on a trial. Directing clinical supply for use in the region from a single location where it's located in or outside of the Asia-Pacific region can be inefficient. It can be difficult. It can be expensive, and it can be lengthy from a timing standpoint. Using a regional network that provides a number of hubs within the region, provided by a global supplier of clinical supplies and services, studies sponsors can create a clinical supply packaging and distribution engine within the region to their success in running global trials. A well-positioned network will perform more effectively, efficiently, and with less risk in the supply chain to disrupt the supplies to the trial. This is possible in a hub model, much more so than in a single location model. Although it may not eliminate all the regional challenges that might be controlled by the regulation, logistics, infrastructure, etc., it still substantially improves the success of sponsors running a trial in the region. There's no other place where the voice of experience and the location of your partner makes such an impact as in Asia Pacific. So sponsors really want a collective knowledge from the global clinical supply partners that looks at clinical activities and views that the single sponsor doesn't always have access to, and to bring those experiences to bear in the Asia Pacific market. Let's take a look now at how the network hub strategy has developed over the time. So this chart shows the major grouping of the steps in evolution of the supply chain for a traditional supply-led model. On the left is a general category shown by the brackets that supplies packaged outside the region and brought to and distributed to the countries and clinical inside the region. It involves local affiliates, clinical services, and CROs, as well as clinical material distributors to get the material into countries and then to the clinics. On the right-hand side, in the separate part of the bracket, there you will see Asia Pacific Hub Strategy grouping, wherein we achieve a superior network to support the sponsors in this area. We have a full service capability and the capacity in the network. We have supply and distribution flexibilities. We have a local staff that connected into a global network of clinical supply experts. We have created these supply points at key locations in the region. We are close to where the clinical actions is and the target patient population is. It's quite a growth from the left of this chart, basically bringing everything in and then concentrating on full service clinical supply sites selectively located in the region. Let's take a look at what it looks like on a global map, just to kind of walk through the history here. Most of you are aware that the supply originally came into region from offshore. They are bulk shipped in, and they went to third-party depots for subsequent distribution into the clinical sites. This was a very onerous process because importation of these supplies had a lot of complexity. It's a lot of time, efforts, and there's a lot of risk in getting materials into the region. After that, what we saw was Singapore was started as an initial point for global clinical supply providers to set up a distribution point in the region. The map shows how Singapore, which was essentially a large free trade zone, allowed supplies to come in and get safe and sound on the ground in Singapore, and then distributed out to the countries from this point. But still, with diversity, location, physical proximity, it wasn't an optimal solution. So some of the challenges of getting into some of these countries exist, even though you had that stopover point. After that, what we saw was the setup, what we call the country-specific distribution points. As the demand for and appeal for trials in these countries increased, we had to get closer and closer to the target patient population, where the clinical trials were going to be run. We have seen over time the move still again with the combination of things. Bulk supplies coming in, using Singapore extensively to the north and to the south, and then also setting up shop in China area, as I mentioned, in Catalent's experience. Beyond that, you can actually see the next stage of the development is using China as a Singapore, or emulating Singapore in terms of flexibility to work into the country commerce area, as well as, again, out of the country. And it's better proximity to support, for instance, South Korea and Japan from that area. The free trade zone availability in China made it equally attractive as Singapore was in the earlier days to get material landed safe and sound on the ground with minimal transportation risks for temperature excursion and so on. Then you can work on the importation into China, or you can work into export out to the countries that are surrounding the China area. It really becomes, at that point, a practical logistic consideration in terms of the cost and timing to get supplies moved out. It's not necessarily a risk of getting the supplies into the region. Then finally, what we are seeing here in this chart is the development of the country-specific, exclusively site to serve certain markets, for instance, in Japan. We have seen supplies go into Japan, but the preference of the industry is, and the market there in Japan is to have a distribution from within Japan, as opposed to it coming from outside. We believe, and we see a trend here in Japan and other countries in the region that will set up these exclusive shops to act as a depot, so the global clinical supply providers will have this presence, and we are basically working our way into the region to effectively provide supply solutions to the sponsor. So Singapore hub can really help supply studies in the majority countries in the region, as I mentioned. It was kind of first beachhead into the region in an essentially large free trade zone, and it provided basic distribution at the time. It's now become helpful to have a secondary packaging and labeling capabilities at that side, giving you increased flexibility to handle the challenge of clinical supplies if there is an expiry or something like that. We are also seeing the need with the shift to biologics to have extended cold chain storage capabilities. You really need to have the right locations in the region to serve this hotspot, and you need to have the right capability and capacity. And Singapore is a good example here. where you have a secondary packaging, cold chain returns, and destruction, and so on. The business model for Singapore is very straightforward. Has a long history of trade as trade hub, established lines in and out, competitive ways to ship products in and out of the country. As I mentioned earlier, it is one large free trade zone. Clinical supplies industry friendly there in terms of regulatory and logistics, not only handling the inbound, but the outbound part of the distribution, and including the returns and destruction at some point in the life of the trial. It's very business friendly, good infrastructure, and language and ease of access, and the location is terrific for the industry. If you take a look at China, we actually have a hub in one of the China's free trade zone. It's called Waigaoqiao Free Trade Zone near the Pudong Airport. Many benefits for being in this location there. Again, this is one of our foundation hubs in the region where we have a primary and secondary packaging, label, low humidity. So basically, all the things that the sponsor has gone to expect in that part of the world. We got that now in China facility. It really provides this primary hub capability for distribution as well as packaging in the region, if the client wants to do that. I will talk about some of the advantage of free trade zone on the next chart. Although the business model for China is quite interesting, in Singapore, it's mostly just as a stopover point to go to other places. In China, as we pointed out earlier, there's a significantly large concentration of trials. So in this case, you want to be able to go into China for China studies. You want to be able to come out of China to the proximity around China. It makes sense logistically to support some of the other countries, as I mentioned, like Korea, or possibly shipping into Japan, Taiwan, Thailand, and so on. It really became a logistic decision at that point. If you had the right capability to optimize the locations of your inventory and the distribution of that inventory into the region, you have the ability to get access to goods from China if there's a competitor there in the region. You can bring that out to the free trade zone and marry it up with the supplies coming from other places. You can go back into China or go out of China. There's a lot of scenarios that are possible by having the right capability, the right capacity in terms of clinical supply offering. And the free trade zone is a great combination to work in the region. You have this access. It's a launch point to other countries in and out for supplies or for materials and components, or in or out for clinical finished products. It's also a neutral regulatory zone. There's a lot of things you can do in the free trade zone that you could do if you were within the regulatory oversight of the CFDA, for example. There's some flexibility. I will talk about that here in this next chart. Here on this chart, we highlighted a number of advantages. Those of you that get presentation, you will be able to have this for reference. But financially, there is a substantial duty deferral where you can bring materials onto the free trade zone and not have to pay any duty because it's in the bonded status, meaning duty not paid until we choose to import it into China, and then you can basically throttle the payment of duty based on the recruitment and the needs to ship supplies into China. In some cases, duty is eliminated altogether because you are not really going into the country. You are going to now export out of the country to one of the regional proximity countries that may need some clinical supplies. I mentioned a few regulatory things here. On this chart, you will see a couple of comments about, I mentioned the ease of expiry relabeling. That can be done easily in the free trade zone. Again, it's in the regulatory neutral area, allows the supply to be secured in the manufacturing and the packaging and labeling to be done prior to the completion of the CTA. This is a really timing advantage for sponsors because a lot of work that can be done in parallel with the CTA application as opposed to sequentially and at the point of approval of CTA. You could basically have your supplies ready to go and start the importation process. It's really a significant advantage. And just jumping up to the logistical area, we have deferred customs importation as well. Getting safe and sound on the ground, as I mentioned earlier, into the free trade zone is really a matter of a bound transportation from the Pudong airport. It doesn't require customs importation approval. It gets materials on this. This is especially important for temperature controlled material to get in to the right storage conditions, and also, eliminate excursion, and that happens very easily without issue. You don't have to worry about the stuff sitting in the customs sub-storage condition or delays on invoicing or valuation or any of the things that happen over the years. It gets it right into the safe place, and then you can work on importation, the quantity, frequency that is desired basically for the trial in a much easier way. I mentioned the clearance there. You really get cleared on demand for the supplies that you want to send into China. Then if you want to export, all of that is also bounded. So there's no restrictions to then go out of the country. It's just physical transportation to the airport into wherever you go. This next chart shows Japan. I mentioned earlier, in-country hub relative to Japan is essential. They want to run the trials in Japan. They want to have the supplies distributed in Japan. So we have establishing this capability to have secondary packaging, labeling, and specialized services to suit the Japanese market. Again, language, culture, and on-the-ground presence is super important. We have a set here with 50+ years of experience that we are going to leverage to help us provide a set that to meet those objectives in Japan. The model for Japan is also very straightforward. Local facility with a local support, the right capability to serve the market. There are some unique practice there relative to quality standard and stuff that the local team is very familiar with, and obviously the language and knowledge of the customs process is key. This is necessary for local trials as well as the length of the study for global trials that are going into Japan. One other unique consideration for Japan, and it's true, I think, on some of other countries, is the proximity of where you locate the hub in terms of the urban centers. In terms of transportation route, and even to the extent that you have to watch for force majeure kind of stuff, everybody knows we have the significant earthquake and tsunami in Japan. So having the right location with access to multiple points of entry airports is critical. As you can see here, we have choose a point right between the two major urban centers. that gives us, we feel, good diverse location to risk-grade the specific to Japan. In the case of China, we located near Shanghai, close to Pudong Airport, with very great availability of air and vehicle transportation routes to and from Shanghai as well. The use of regional hub-based approach from global clinical supply providers is key advantage for sponsors in Asia-Pacific region. You can create a robust supply chain for current model. This includes a well-positioned network that allow us to perform more effectively and efficiently for the sponsors. There's a less risk of disruption, more flexibility, and it mitigates a lot of the region challenges that I mentioned earlier. Sponsors can get that collective knowledge of a global clinical supply provider through the windows of the hubs that are in the region. It's much more improved than what you would have with a single site model or introducing and distributing material from offshore. So in our case, we have the model including the hub, including primary hub in China with full service capabilities. This location is able to serve the entire market, but really you can see this gray band that I put in here is the target zone if we needed to. But again, we have flexibility. Singapore, as I mentioned earlier, is able to serve. It can go north or it can go south. It's ideally suited for Australia and for New Zealand, for example, and then Malaysia area. But you can also go north. A lot of people go into Singapore now and go north to South Korea. But you can also see logistically, the ability of shipments out of free trade zone in China gives you much more advantage and proximity to Japan and South Korea, for example, compared with Singapore. But ultimately, you want to have the flexibility to go either way, to have the backup capability to serve the market, and always make sure that you can get the supplies where you want them. Then, as I mentioned, we are going to see, I think, an increasing number of countries specific exclusive branded sites, but the clinical supply providers versus third-party network providers to bring that capability for sponsors or used to have in other regions of the world. If you stand back and look at this, this is really a repeating history because this is how the network developed in the United States and in Europe as the sponsors started pursuing supplies from outside providers. They set up a network with the capability and locations to serve the concentration of United States and Europe, for example. Choosing the right supplier, again, is the key, and have the right location is really the difference between great success in the region or trouble in the region. The hub approach, we think, really facilitates that. But that not all. What about the clinical supply model that I mentioned earlier? If you think ahead now, whatever you do, you want to start with a end in demand, so to speak, and have your hub model be able to adapt and provide the future supply models that we see. So planning for today and tomorrow requires that we respect all these considerations and the challenges to succeed in Asia Pacific. Waiting for chart to change here. So the Asia Pacific region is and will continue to be an important market. This is kind of a wrap-up chart. I hope I demonstrated that in terms of the concentration that we see the market and clinical data says it's going to be appealing. There are a lot of challenges in that country that needs to be overcome, but it really is desirable for sponsors to go. Having an experienced partner with on-ground support is a critical component to success there. The clinical supply model is evolving to better support the use of scarce or expensive resources, as I mentioned. The market is moving towards biologics and ultimately biosimilars, which is going to require more specialized storage conditions. The distribution points and hubs are going to have to keep up with the demand in the terms of having the right capacity at the right place. You can see the benefits of having capacity like in the free trade zone, giving you in the free trade zone, giving you a huge flexibility to keep the product secure, but also the flexibility to get it where you want it. I mentioned the timelines, the needs for shorter study timelines. Getting closer to the destination will help that. The hub strategy supports that. Supply chain responsiveness and the demand variability is always an issue. The closer you are, the quicker you are, can react. The hub strategy supports that, and the population of the clinical sites in patients is very close and gives you a key advantage in Asia Pacific. So overall, clinical supply management in Asia Pacific region can be really helped and optimized through hub-based approach. That's the way we are headed. We have done a substantial amount of work there. I have seen a great success in supporting our sponsors in the region. We can leverage each of key country advantages, and especially that FTC flexibility that allow us for better planning, better flexibility in the supply chain to meet the needs of the sponsors. I will going to turn it back to Andrew here so that we can go into Q&A session. Great. Andrew, over to you. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Daniel. That was a great presentation, lots of insight to be had there. So at this point, I would like our audience to continue sending in their questions and their comments. And right now, using that questions window, for this is the Q&A portion of the webinar. And Daniel, we've received some questions here already, so let's get started. Our first question, can all packaging be done in Europe and only depots in the APAC region used to supply studies there?
Yeah, you can package in a single place in Europe. You can package in the United States. You could basically go back to the model that says I'm going to push material there from some far off locations, and it's doable. We don't feel it's as good as having that packaging done closer. A lot of sponsor companies actually are still kind of inching their way into China. They have a preference in sites that they work with for packaging, establish the capabilities and so on. But I think in time, you will see increase in confidence and more packaging will be done closer to those regions. Yes, I think it's possible, but it's not optimal. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Noted. Thank you for that. Another question here. When building a network, do you have to use the same partner for all locations, or can you work with different vendors?
Yeah, actually, our recommendation would be to use a partner for the hub network. I think you get a lot of advantages and the synergies there in the region. And you can leverage the capability and actually mitigate risks by having, redundant capacity that can do similar things with a single provider. I would recommend that you will go with a single provider for the hub strategy.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that as well. Daniel, does having an APAC network make sense for local companies, or is it better suited to global companies running studies in the region?
Yes, we are actually seeing more local companies conduct their trials in other countries of the region, and also even in the United States or Europe. So, for example, more biotech companies in China will design their studies with clinical sites in Australia, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and some of the Southeast Asia countries. So with the APAC network, they can get inventories closer to the clinical sites, as mentioned before, with much shorter response time for the orders into the clinical sites in these countries. And in the meantime, an Asia-Pac network can also back up each other on capacity capabilities in case on demand, there's a demand spike, let's say for secondary packaging or storage distribution, then we can have other sites in the network to support to help to deal with the spec in the region. Yeah.
Okay, interesting. Thanks for that as well. Another related question here: why not just use a central sourcing strategy to cover this region instead of using a network?
Well, the central could do the job, but it's not optimal. I mean, you really want to take advantage, as I mentioned, of the free trade zone flexibility, first of all. You want to take advantage of local expertise to language. In this diverse market, if you look at the United States, for example, you have all these trials in a common language. You don't have that in Asia Pacific region. You have this diverse geographic presence in the trial. You have to really think hard about logistics. I'm not sure you're able to come up on an optimal point that's better. So in fact, I'm sure you won't be able to come up with an optimal point and a single source point to service that the whole region. You will going to have distribute your capability. Again, one of the primary thing is to get closer to the patient in clinical action. You cannot do that from far away.
Okay, thank you for that as well. Moving on now to another question. This audience member says, Singapore and China both seem like good options for a central depot. Is one better than the other?
Okay, I would say it depends on where you want to go. If you want to go into China, I think history shows that we were actually going into China with Singapore, but it wasn't easy. So having a free trade zone and a location in China is better to service imports into the country than Singapore, for sure. So to answer the question better, it depends on where you want to go. As I try to show in the map, you have the flexibility to go north or south in both instances. It really becomes a logistical question and importation question. So if we are talking about just going into China, I would say the China free trade zone is better. If we are talking about going to Australia, probably Singapore is better. So in between those two, you need to do the math on the logistics and the cost of importation, taxes, duty, and all those things.
Right. Okay. Thank you for that as well. So on that note, this similar question here: when selecting locations to include in the network, should preference be given to countries such as China where there are free trade zones, and if so, why?
Yes, the free trade zone availability is obviously very attractive. We saw that in my presentation in Singapore and in China, if other countries like North Korea or other countries in, South Korea and other countries in northern part, they decide to do that, we will certainly look at that. I think the hub strategy works perfectly fine by having a few of those spots in the region, because you are really looking for a launching point into the region. It becomes a logistical question at some point. I think the more free trade zones are there, the more we want to take advantage of those in that region.
Right, absolutely. Thanks for that as well. Moving on to another question here on Japan. So what is the benefit of having a location in Japan when studies there could be supplied from elsewhere in the region, such as Singapore?
Yeah, I mentioned a couple of those special considerations, and I will repeat a couple of those just for clarity. I think that the biggest thing is overriding culture desire to have the products being distributed from somewhere within Japan, first of all. The second one would be in people in the industry working with the sponsors that work in Japan know that there's a higher level of quality and scrutiny associated with that. So that's another very specific thing. That's why we are using our Kakigawa. One of the reasons why we use Kakigawa soft gel plant as a launching point for our depot, because we have that experience in terms of the expectation of clinical supply and the sponsors in that region, and ultimately patients. So there's a high degree of scrutiny over that. That's another consideration. So language is also a key item relative to working in Japan. When you try to in Japan from outside without good local people working with the customs and the language and being able to communicate effectively, it becomes much more difficult and therefore more time consuming and potentially more risks to get products in. So those would be the three other keys.
Okay, thank you for that as well. Maybe one or two more questions here for you. So Korea is a major country for clinical studies, but you don't yet have a location there. Why not?
Yeah, I think you will see that happening in Korea relatively quickly as the demand increase and the market unfolds. In the case of Korea, we have a relatively, I will say, ease of entry into the Korean market to get supplies there. We are currently shipping to Korea out of Singapore and out of China, as mentioned. It's not an onerous process. We don't see in Korea that I call it the country-specific demand that we see in Japan. So if that changes over time, it will certainly be a great place to set up a hub. It probably would be a country-specific hub as I described it.
Right, okay, thanks for that as well. Daniel, maybe one final question here for you. Is the network approach more difficult to manage versus having a single location? As mentioned, there are many benefits from the network approach. Obviously, with the network strategy, you're going to want to have a good portal into what the sponsor sees that we have and laid out against the projections that they have for their recruitment and adjust that. So we have a portal that allows clients to see where their inventories are. So we also have a service that we provide to help in terms of demand projection so that we can keep the supplies properly balanced in the right quantity for the target destinations. So basically with our experience in the region, Catalent will assist our customers to better manage the clinical supply even from the planning stage.
so to achieve a strategic advantage in the region.
Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you very much for that, Daniel. We have reached the end of the question and answer portion of this webinar. But if you do have any further questions for Daniel, you can write to him via the email address showing on your screen right now. That's daniel.gao@catalent.com, and I encourage you to do that. If we weren't able to attend to your questions today, the team at Catalent may try to follow up with you after the webinar. And thank you everyone for participating in today's webinar. You'll be receiving a follow-up email from Xtalks with access to the recorded archive for this event. And a survey window will be popping up on your screen shortly. Your participation is appreciated as it'll help us improve our further webinars. Now I'm just about to send you a link in your chat box. You can say thanks to our speaker via Twitter using that link. So thank you very much, Daniel. Great presentation and great Q&A today. We hope that you found this webinar informative. Have a great day, everyone.